Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, Phyllis and Richard L. Gelb, the Malkin Fund, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America and Rudolph Finn. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. I began to be in 1956. And after all these decades of on-the-air conversations with guests of all types and shapes of intellectual configurations, perhaps a pair of our most interesting exchanges took place 2 years ago at this table when John Sexton became president of New York University, assuming the leadership of the nation's largest private university, without any question bringing to his new task all the skill and enthusiasm and boundless energies that had characterized his many years as dean of NYU's great law school. Well, I titled our conversation then, "The University as Enterprise," snitching this favorite theme from President Sexton himself. Today, our title is "The University as Sacred Place," as I borrow again from my guest, this time from a quite extraordinary and thoughtful major Sexton address at Fordham, in truth his alma mater, from which he earned his B.A. in history, his M.A. in comparative literature, and his Ph.D. in the history of American religion, and to which he here pays this tribute, quote, "Both my person and my ideas were formed most especially in the cauldron of this great university," end quote. So, to begin our conversation today, let me ask my guest what makes the university a sacred place. John, why do you call it that?
Well, the university is such a special institution. There is this wonderful piece of data. Think of this, Richard. There are 85 institutions today in the world that exist in the same form that they existed more than 500 years ago. Now, a man like you could name many of them. You know, the Parliament, the Vatican. There are 8 cantons in Switzerland, so I've given you 10. Of the remaining 75, 70 are universities. That's the power of this thing we call the university. Now, here in our society today, I mean, you know from our previous conversations that coming through the lens of my training as a phenomenologist of religion, I tend to use this word sacred to mark special moments, special space, special experiences. So here in our society today, the university is sacred space. I'll use another word that has overtones. It's sanctuary, and it's sanctuary for knowledge and for the pursuit and the advancement of knowledge and the intergenerational transfer of knowledge, the way no other institution in our society is. And I use the word sacred and I use the word sanctuary because I feel that there is a devaluation of this extraordinary institution going on in our society, as well as a devaluation of what universities do at their best. There is in our society generally a movement away from the rigorous pursuit of knowledge, of which universities are the best example there ever has been. So I think it's a time for university leaders and civic leaders to mark the university as sacred, to mark it as sanctuary, both to help preserve its special role in our society, but also to say to the rest of society, take seriously what goes on in our universities in a way it appears you are not now doing in a whole host of ways.
But if it has been devalued, and I certainly think you're right about that, isn't that because one cannot, in this society, with our society's values, have a sacred place set aside as you want the university to be, as it has indeed, as you point out, in all these centuries been set aside?
Well, I would do two amendments to your characteristically, erudite probe, and I know you frequently probe.
You mean I'm wrong, and you're going to show me
how? No, I don't mean you're wrong at all. I mean, first of all, I don't want to get into the American conversation about secularism. Although we could have a whole conversation about the loss of value in our society that would be captured in a conversation about secularism. When I say sacred space, in referring to the university, I don't mean to enter that debate between the sacred and the secular or the First Amendment religion clauses or things that you and I have discussed typically off the air, and which mean a great deal to me. I mean to use it in a sense that is provocative by using a word one normally associates with religion, but in the sense of this specialism, that it is special. The Second Amendment I would offer to your comment is this use of the word apart. Now, I'm particularly sensitive to this as the president of New York University.
Why?
Because New York University was founded by a great man, Albert Gallatin.
Secretary of Treasury.
The longest serving Secretary of Treasury, Jefferson and Madison Secretary of Treasury. And he returned to New York City and with 8 other New Yorkers, and in conversation with the people who simultaneously were forming the University College in London, began to conceptualize what he called a different kind of university from the then prevailing great universities, Oxford, Cambridge, the Ivy League schools in America. And his notion was that there was room for another paradigm, and it's a paradigm that we aggressively embrace at NYU today. And his phrase was to create a university that was, quote, in and of the city, close quote. And this is at the core of our vision of NYU. It's not all of what we do. Certainly this topic we have for discussion today, the sanctuary of the university, is a core element. But at NYU, we embrace New York City. We embrace being in and of the city. We don't view ourselves as being apart. When you walk out of one of our buildings, and there are hundreds of them, when you walk out of one of our buildings, you will never touch grass. You will never go through a gate. You touch New York sidewalk, and we embrace all that means. So I do not view what goes on in what I'm calling the sanctuary, the sacred space of the university. I do not view that as apart from the world or the polis. There are moments when it is, but in remarkable ways and unpredictable ways. What seems highly remote, what goes on in an isolated lab someplace, can have extraordinary effects that it's important for universities to see as translating into the world. So when I talk about the university as sacred space or sanctuary, I am not talking about the university withdrawn. That would be antithetical not only to the notion that I have at the university, but to the core notion of my university, NYU, which is why I say I'm particularly sensitive to it.
But there is the idea of the university. And your speech at Fordham was so much like the idea of the university that we know about. There is the idea of the university that you consider sacred.
Yes, that's certainly true, and your evocation of Cardinal Newman is important. I would, if you'd permit me, say that while I start as a product of Jesuit education, not just at Fordham, but at an extraordinary Jesuit high school that hasn't existed for 30 years, but that lives in the hearts of those of us who enjoyed it. so 12 years of Jesuit education, I take Cardinal Newman very seriously. I do not think that even Cardinal Newman's magnificent description of the idea of the university encompasses the greatness either of the American Research University generally today, or of what I would envision as the next move beyond that might be exemplified by NYU. So I would immediately jump from John Cardinal Newman to one of the finest books that I've read in this line of descendancy about the modern research university, which is a work called The Idea of the University, a Re-Examination, written by the great patristic scholar Jaroslav Pelikan of Yale in 1992 for the celebration of the 100th anniversary of his alma mater, the University of Chicago. And it's a wonderful book that is exegetical of Newman, but says, what would Newman say today about the research university in America? And Jaroslav Pelikan expands Newman's ideas and applies it to the notion of research, which is certainly for the leadership universities that I envision, for those that really embrace this notion of sanctuary and sacred space for a genuine development of knowledge. The research university is paradigmatic. And then I have to say that I would go myself beyond even Pelikan's magnificent presentation to a presentation that is more in and of the world around it, and hence engages professional schools, for example, in the notion of a research university in a way that even Pelikan didn't in 1992.
In all of this, there is a word that stands out so in this wonderful Fordham speech: dialogue. That, John Sexton seems to feel so strongly, is at the basis of the modern university, must be. Am I getting that correctly?
You're getting it correctly. It has to be contextualized, if you'd allow me for a second to do that. The university is first and foremost about the pursuit and advancement of knowledge, and as I said earlier, the intergenerational passing. Creating disciples of knowledge that we send out, our graduates. The first principle of that pursuit is the rigorous examination of ideas against standards. It is not the case that we should allow the pursuit of knowledge to collapse into some intellectual relativism or some agnosticism about, the pursuit of truth and knowledge. There are norms and standards against which we can judge ideas. All ideas are not equal. There is a hierarchy of ideas that can be created, and at the core of the university is that rigorous testing of ideas against standards. And what that means is that we never must lose our commitment to that notion. Now, as part of that process, and here enters what I address in the Fordham speech, as part of that process, one key device, and the one on which I focus in that speech, is a commitment to an open dialogue of ideas, the willing to hear and listen to and engage with an opposing viewpoint. And it is in that context that I advance the notion of dialogic space, the sacred space, the sanctuary that the university presents, because I see in our civic discourse generally a movement away from genuine, nuanced, and what I would call vertical conversation of the sort that you stimulate on this show, that goes deeper and deeper into a subject, and test the ideas of the proponent against opposing viewpoints, rigorous standards. Even about 3 weeks before I gave the Fordham speech, America was going through the primary process, and it started, of course, with the Iowa caucuses. Well, I'm a person who loves to watch C-SPAN. So I mean, I'm so far over on one side of this spectrum of trying to soak up this information that I watched the C-SPAN 1 and C-SPAN 2 broadcast on Iowa caucus night of the two caucuses, in Adair, Iowa, and Davenport. Here, in what was presented in the popular press as this exercise in democracy, where you engaged neighbor, and I heard virtually nothing that even went to the level of the press lines of the Sunday shows being exchanged among those Iowa neighbors. They were more concerned with the count and the vote and where the people were in the room. And there was very little engagement on ideas. And this is what's come to characterize our civic discourse. And it is in that context, too, that I pushed the university forward as perhaps the last hope in our society to begin a counter-movement where we begin to have serious dialogue and debate. But the point I want to emphasize is it's part of the process of knowledge advancement, not all of it.
And who participates in that dialogue?
Well, now we're talking about dialogue inside the university.
I understand.
And I think a core notion that I advanced in the Fordham speech that's quite controversial has to do with the president of the university or the dean of the law school's role in this dialogic space. Now, I did my doctoral dissertation on Charles Eliot, who many would say was the greatest university president ever, from 1869 to 1909.
Don't forget to mention Harvard.
He was president of Harvard, right? He formed the modern Harvard. And he did it in an age when the great research universities were being formed. And then when he stepped down as president after 40 years in 1909, he lived for 17 more years and was called universally the first citizen of America. Eliot was a man who believed in the bully pulpit. He believed he had the answers, and he was very, very willing to give them. So I have seen an example of the bully pulpit president.
And you reject it.
I do. That's what's, and I understand my position is a minority position. I disable myself. I say that when I became president, indeed, when I was dean of the law school, I took the same position. When I became dean of the law school, I said, I lost my ability publicly to express my political opinions. Now, was that because I was a coward? Just because there's a critique of university presidents today. They say, where are the Eliots? Where are the public speakers? I have to say it wasn't because I was a coward, and I don't think in the case of the great university presidents in this country, of whom there are many, it's because they are cowards, at least in the cases that I know. It's because the role of the university president in these times when this dialogic space, when this sacred space for the testing of ideas is so fragile, the role of the university president, first and foremost, must be to protect and nurture and advance that space. And except in areas where the university president is compelled to speak, and then there are certain areas where you're compelled to speak because they intrinsically involve the nature of the university and the definition of the academic community, such as affirmative action or financial aid policies or things of this sort. Except in those areas, for the university president to speak and identify himself with a particular position, I believe, and I try to make a case in the Fordham speech, undermines the moral credibility of that person when it comes down to making tough judgments as to how to manage that space. So when you ask the question, who should be in that space, my first answer is that as a general matter, and I do go into some exceptions to that.
Not the president.
Not the president. Then one could go to the other side and say, well, as a general matter, who should be in there? And I start but don't end with something that looks like the soapbox theory. The pure Athenian democracy. a pure First Amendment free speech, every voice heard.
But you don't end there.
No, I don't end there, and I don't end there because I think that one has to, and here the conversation gets quite nuanced, and I won't say too much to start, and then you can push it where you wish, but there's certain obligations that come with moving into the sacred space, at least for most of the speakers. Now, what do I mean by that, so as not to be inscrutable? Well, there are the permanent residents of the space, the people inside the university. They have to, it seems to me, accept a pledge of respect for the space, respect for other viewpoints as they move into the space. That should be part of the understanding for those that are permanently in there, the defining it. Then one gets into other questions as, well, do people invited by the president have to accept that? Do people invited by constituent groups where the president might be pressured by some to ban a speaker have to accept that? And that's where my ideas become a little bit more subtle. But as a general matter, the president should stay out of the space. And as a general matter, there's a presumption in favor of speakers being allowed into the space, and a presumption against censorship of any kind that has to be justified.
Yet the question always of a line, and where do you draw the line? Right. You do draw a line.
Right, and now we're in...
Aside from the president's being outside.
Right.
Inside but outside.
And here we have to play it out in terms of different actors. I mean, the people inside the space presumptively have the freedom to say anything they wish without the president or anyone else judging them because of academic freedom.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean presumptively because academic freedom creates a broad gauge. If, however, behavior inside the space becomes obviously antithetical to the nature of the space itself, while censorship of the speaker, now we're talking about the internal speaker, the faculty member, the student, whatever, where censorship of the speaker would never be appropriate. Certain time, place, and manner rules might be appropriate. The avoidance of certain kinds of behavior, such as assault, clearly would be appropriate. And in certain circumstances where, for example, racism is involved, or an attempt in the classroom to impose ideological tests. Ideological tests may be protected by academic freedom, even in the classroom, but the shaming of the person that does that might be appropriate.
I wondered what you meant by that.
So these are speakers inside. These are I think shame has a lot of strength that our society has kind of lost because we're so unwilling to say that ideas are shameful. I think we should do that more. That comes back to this fact that ideas can be judged. But in the sacred space, what's shameful is an unwillingness to listen, an unwillingness to engage, an unwillingness to live by the very rules of the dialogue. But then there are other, that has to do with internal actors. Then with regard to people that come in from outside, again, the presumption is the speaker can be allowed in, certainly if invited by someone. Yeah. But I think there are limits there too.
John, the darn trouble with our conversations today is that it's so limited in time, and I keep getting a signal we have very little time left, and we've got to pick this up again. But doesn't this concept really give the president, who has withdrawn, in a sense, he doesn't participate in these by your own wish, doesn't it give him, as the adjudicator of who speaks and who doesn't, who passes the test of appropriateness, an enormous power?
Yes and no. First, I want to make it clear that I am not in favor of the silent president. Okay?
You sound that way, John.
But on certain issues, I mean, I think there certainly was no dean of an American law school who stood more strongly against the terrible governmental bigotry of the Solomon Amendment than did I when I was dean of NYU. But that had to do with the internal matters of law schools in the United States. Now, when you get to this part of presidential or decanal activity, which is, as I'm saying, committed to safeguarding this fragile sanctuary that universities represent, there you're completely correct. There's to the extent, and it's a limited extent, to be fair to my paper, but to the extent that the president or the dean would get involved in adjudicating the appropriateness for a speaker to be in the space, it is dangerous. And it runs counter to the presumption of the soapbox model, the Athenian democracy model. And I propose in the paper that there be structural safeguards involving, at NYU, we've decided, for example, to involve the university senate in this, and where the president is not a free agent in this regard.
The worst safeguard of all here is the goodbye signal I just got. But you're going to come back and talk more about this, I trust.
If you wish.
I wish. John Sexton, thank you so much for joining me today. And thanks too to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. The Open Mind owes much to its guests, like the one today, who for nearly a half-century now have generously interrupted busy schedules to share their insights into the challenges Americans face in so many important areas of our national life. Now, the objective of our conversations has always been to provide the light of reasoned discourse, rather than the heat of verbal battle, and that objective surfaces clearly in this first volume of my new Conversational History of Modern America, edited by Mark Jaffe and with a foreword by Mario Cuomo, an Avalon book published by Carolyn Graff. Here are memorable words from Martin Luther King, Jonas Salk, Malcolm X, Betty Friedan, Bill Moyers, Rudolph Giuliani, Thurgood Marshall, Gloria Steinem, and dozens more. Read the book. I think you'll like it. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, Phyllis and Richard L. Gelb, the Malkin Fund, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America and Rudolph Finn.